How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 236 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode is answering a listener's questions. So, last week or the week before, I got a question in from Siobhan Gallagher. So, initially, the message started off in a message of thanks for the podcast. So, she's been listening to the podcast for a number of months and has learned so much from it. So, as I said, delighted to hear those type of messages. And since I mentioned it last week, a good few people have messaged on the fan mail section. So when you go into, wherever you're listening to the podcast, when you go into the show notes at the very, very top of that, you will see message me. And if you send me a message there, just let me know where you're listening. Tell me about your garden. Tell me about the podcast, how it has helped you, anything you'd like to hear, see, have different on the podcast. It's great. But some lovely messages, and I might get to those, over the next couple of weeks, maybe give people a mention on the podcast if they want. And some of them were really nice and exactly what I needed to hear, I guess, because I know that it is still impacting in the way that I initially intended to. And that is, I guess, to help people in their own gardens to do whatever it is that they're doing in their own gardens. So the fact that, to get those messages is great. So as I said, check out that and send a message by all means. It's great to hear from people. Sometimes, as I said, you don't know who's listening, you don't know where they're listening, you don't know about their gardens. And so to have that kind of information gives me more ammunition, I guess, to create episodes that will be useful and will be beneficial to you guys, which is what it's all about. So Siobhan, as I say, messaged initially with a message of thanks for the podcast and how she's learning from it, and then asked a question to be covered on the podcast. And it's kind of a few parts to it. It's so she built a house a number of years ago, I think, back 5, 6, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, maybe, that sort of time frame. And it's a house on a long, narrow site. So the site is narrow, as in the boundary is, not too far from the side of the house on each side. But it's a long site running all the way down, and it's on a really steep slope, actually. So her big project this year is to get the driveway done, because it's hard to maintain a driveway on a really steep site, as many of you might know. So that's the big project in terms of, further development around the house. And that, that's going to take a big budget. And so the boundaries on either side, so one boundary to another house has a really old and large Griselinia hedge, which she said is, basically taking a lot of effort, time, and in some cases money to maintain that because of the size of it. It's gone very, very deep, very, very wide, and can be hard to keep, I suppose, in check. So, and we'll come back to that in a minute as another element. So there's that. And on the opposite side, there's some birch trees. And these trees look really well in the summertime. They obviously are fully leafed up. And then in the wintertime, they lose their leaves. And that gives the house next door kind of a clear view into her kitchen and into her sunroom. And to sort of set the stage a little bit, the sunroom on the house has a set of French doors which come off to the side, and that's the view straight in there that her neighbor can see. But on the gable end, there's two huge windows that go basically from the ground level right the way up into the gable of the house. And that's because that view out gives you a view out onto a water body, which I'm not actually sure if it's the sea or a lake. I presume it's the sea, but I'm not certain. So it's a brilliant view out in that direction is the point. And but on the other side where the double doors are, which open out to the side of the sunroom, there's visibility for neighbors directly in there. And obviously that's a chill out area. That's an area where you might sit down and have a glass of wine on an evening, and into the kitchen sink, which is obviously where that's an area as well where you don't want people looking in on top of you generally. So the challenge that one of the challenges is that these trees are given screening in the summertime, but not in the winter. So she was asking for an evergreen hedge that would go 2 to 3 meters tall that would sort of just block those couple of windows into her home that, for people in the next site, that they're not looking directly into her kitchen or into her sunroom. So it gives you that little bit of privacy, I guess. It doesn't in any way affect the view, the beautiful view that is out to the other end of the house, which, as I say, looking out on a body of water, which looks like the sea. And that's a brilliant view, and it won't in any way impact that, but it just gives you a little bit more, I suppose, privacy on that side. And the reason I mentioned the Griselinia is that's difficult to keep currently for her, and she's, long term, that's difficult, it's costly, and she's not overly enamored by Griselinia. So before we rule out that, Griselinia is an excellent hedge, especially if you are near the anywhere near the coastline, because it doesn't like heavy frosts. We haven't got really, really heavy frost since 2010, 11, at which point there was a lot of Griselinia killed around the country, especially inland. But it is a good hedge. And the reason I'm saying don't rule it out initially is that it's on the opposite side of the house already. So if you're looking for a little bit of uniformity, then Griselinia could be a good option on this side. Now, two things. Number one, Griselinia is a hedge that will grow well there. It's very easy to keep to whatever kind of height you desire, and the height that she wants to kind of block off at is kind of, 1.5 to 2 meters in height, and that'll give the privacy into her kitchen and sunroom without actually blocking the view outwards too much. So with that kind of height, once a year, it would be really easy to cut Griselinia once a year. It's not a heavy hedge to cut at any stage, unless it has gone completely overrun, and we'll come to that in a moment. But it's an easy enough hedge to keep. It's a nice kind of, limey green color, and it's evergreen. And the fact that you're, near the coast, from what I can see, it's not going to be affected by frost. So that's a good hedge. So I wouldn't rule it out to replicate the opposite side. And, as I say, I know you don't like it, but your experience of it is the one on the opposite side, which is overgrown, which is difficult to manage. But in general, if that hedge is planted, you can pretty much manage that to whatever height you want. A good example of that was it died in 2010, 11, but I planted one around my mum's house that was kept at kind of 4 foot high. It was cut to kind of 2 foot wide, possibly. So really, really narrow and tall, and a slender kind of a hedge, really easy to keep. One cut a year, and that did the trick. And it's a soft cut. You're not cutting through heavy woody material generally with Griselinia. Now, the reason I'm saying don't rule it out, if you flip over to the opposite side where this hedge is overgrown, has thickened out, has got woody, probably has also rerouted as branches fall down and hit the ground. It probably has rerouted in certain parts there. And now you're looking at a kind of a really deep, what looks like, I don't know, maybe 3 meters deep of Griselinia at a height of 2, 3 meters. And that's going to be difficult to keep. Factor in the fact that you're on a really steep slope. You're sloping, lengthways on the site, but you're also sloping upwards to your neighbors. So I can imagine that is an extremely difficult hedge to keep. It's, it's going to be strenuous. You're going to need equipment to deal with the size, because you certainly won't reach it with a standard hedge cutters. So I can imagine that is quite tricky to navigate and to manage and to keep tidy at the moment. However, it's very, I won't say easy, but it's very possible to get a Griselinia that has gone that way back into a manageable state, because where you cut it, it will sort of reshoot from wherever you cut it. So that's something that's a possibility for you. So you might be able to, hack that back, get it back to a manageable width and height and shape. And okay, it's going to look like a seriously tough haircut for a while. And then eventually you'll get it back to a kind of a state where, where you are able to manage it in the same way that you would manage a fresh new hedge. So that's an option. I wouldn't rule it out. It's also in terms of cost effectiveness, because huge budget is not available because of the ongoing developments on the driveway. So it's a possibility. Now, depending on the thickness of that existing Griselinia hedge, depending on the woodiness of it, it may not be possible to take that back to the desired width all in one go. You might need to kind of stage it a little bit. So over 2 or 3 years, 4 years maybe, take it back in little by little, keep it healthy, keep it alive, and then get it back to a shape that's manageable. And that is most certainly possible. And now you've planted your new hedge on the opposite side. If you really wanted to get, economical with it, you could take your own cuttings off it, and that may do well for you. But it's going to be possible then to get that back into shape, plant a new hedge on the opposite side, and now you have uniformity on both sides of the house. So that's an option. So I know Griselinia is a 9 at the moment. You don't like the look of it at the moment, but that could be based on the fact that what you have doesn't look good. It's difficult to manage. So I'm sure you have, but have a look at some Griselinia hedges. I'm sure there's some local to you. Keep your eyes open as you're driving around. There's probably some that are well managed, that look good, and it might just change your mind on it a little bit. And then it means that you're not looking for a huge revamp on both sides of the house. It's more of a transition, and you're not going to need a huge amount of new plants to do it, because you're doing one side as opposed to two. So that's an option. But to go down through them and to give some other options, because I know that's what you're looking for. You also mentioned that you really like some bamboos, and you mentioned particularly phyllostachys, and in terms of privacy, that can give good privacy. But we'll talk about all of those and the other options. So mention Griselinia, don't rule it out. It's definitely one worth looking at, definitely one worth adding. Another option, again, quite suited to kind of coastal areas, is Escallonia. It will get to the kind of 1.5 meters. At 2 meters, it's more difficult to get it to 2 meters. Will have a flower on it. However, if you want to keep it, to that kind of neat, tidy look, which I'm not sure that you do, but if you do want to keep it to that neat and tidy look, it's kind of going to need 2 cuts a year. A little bit like the Griselinia, though. It's not a heavy type cutting. It's always light, kind of fresh growth, and potentially, as I said, 2 cuts a year. To get that benefit of the flower, you probably need to let it grow out and reduce your cuts to 1 cut a year, but then you lose the sort of real tidy look that you get from the 2 cuts. So that's another really good option as a hedge, is Escallonia. Taxus baccata, superb, absolutely superb hedge to evergreen hedge. So that's the yew hedge. It's a very, very stately looking, high quality hedge. If you can establish it, and that's the caveat, if you can establish it, it's a bulletproof hedge. Nothing affects it. There's no diseases. Frost certainly doesn't affect it. It's very dense, so it'll be a block from the ground up to whatever height you want to get it to. The only, I suppose, disadvantages of it is that it is a little bit difficult to establish, in that it really likes perfect ground. It doesn't like it too dry, doesn't like it too wet. So now this bank should be okay. Possibly in the initial years might be a little bit on the dry side, especially the fact that it's under birch trees. It may be a little bit dry, but that could be easily, amended with a little bit of organic matter as you're, digging it in, farmyard manure or good quality compost. But that's a really good option if you can establish it. Only other thing is, if you're looking for privacy, people tend to want privacy quite quick. The Taxus would be relatively slow, so to get it to that kind of height of 1.5, 2 meters will take a little bit of time. You can buy them bigger, obviously. It tends to be, on the more expensive type hedges, but it is a superb hedge, bulletproof, really good quality. So you can see why, and it is a little bit slower grown. So again, you can see why it might be a little bit more expensive. Another option is in that vicinity where you need that block, you know, that view to be blocked. You could get some bigger ones there, and then as you move out, you could reduce the size, and that's you know, another way of doing it. So that's an option. Another option, and these next couple of options are, I suppose they're seen as a little bit old-fashioned in some ways, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not good options. And I'm thinking particularly here of Lonicera as one. So that used to be called, you know, back in the day, back in Ireland, you know, 30 years ago, that was called poor man's box or poor man's buxus. But it's really not. It's kind of a very good hedge all to its own. It doesn't have any pest or disease problems. It establishes pretty much anywhere, you know, pretty much anywhere. I'll have no hesitation saying it'll grow easily where you're looking to put it. It can be trimmed hard, you know, for the first couple of years, keep it trimmed hard so that it fills to the base, and then let it grow up to the height that you require, 1.5 to 2 meters. And again, you'll be able to keep it nice and tidy up to that kind of 1.5 or 2 meters. Again, it would probably need, if you want to keep that tidy look, you probably need to cut it twice a year. But a bit like Escalonia and Griselinia, it isn't heavy cutting, it's light cutting all the time. Another one that kind of fits into that same bracket again would be a little bit out of fashion at the moment, but still quite a good hedge, is Privet. Now, I know a lot of people have gone away from it, but again, for this purpose, it is a good solid hedge, and you know, you shouldn't completely discount it. You know, I think it's a good option. Another really good option in terms of the look would be Holly Ilex equifolium. That's a really good hedge. I have some here. It's a superb hedge, looks beautiful. Only thing I would say, again, a little bit like the Taxus, is that it's very slow to establish, very slow to hit a height. So if you're looking for a quick hedge for quick privacy, that's not going to be it. But again, really solid hedge. Will do well under the beech trees, you know, because that's, if you think about holly in nature, that's where it kind of establishes, in hedges, in ditches, at the edges of forests. That's where it establishes. So it's going to be able to establish there very, very easily. And again, you could, you know, get some bigger ones in that zone where you're looking to, you know, where you're looking to block out that area, and then finish out the hedge with smaller ones that will come over time. That's an option. So really good hedge, a little bit slow to establish. Another one worth looking at, I've never personally sowed or planted it as a hedge, but I know that some people do, and I know that it does work really well, is Pittosporum. So it's typically seen as a hedge. It's also used in the floristry industry for foliage, but it's really easy to cut, very fast to grow, very dense. So it's definitely going to give you that block that you're looking for, and you can get it in a few different colors depending on the variety. You can get kind of silvery colored leaves, even onto kind of more purpley type leaves. So there's lots of options available in Pittosporum, and it would or could be a good hedge. Another one that's really in fashion at the moment, I personally don't like it, I've spoken about it on the podcast before, is Photinia Red Robin. I think it looks, that fantastic look of the red fiery leaves is class. I have seen it just being very gappy in a lot of places as a hedge. Initially, it can look really good. The colors can look really good. And as I say, it can look really gappy. Also, some kind of disease issues with it a little bit. Potential to get shot hole, potential to get fire blight. So it's, you know, it's not a bulletproof hedge by any means. And as I say, I've seen it doing really well in some places and looking brilliant, but in a lot of places, and you know, on the law of averages, I would say it looks bad in places more than it looks good, and that's never for me a great sign. But I know a lot of people swear by it. Personally, I just don't love it as a hedge. Another option then is, you mentioned that you were considering laurel or cherry laurel. I certainly wouldn't be considering that. The reason being, I think it's, and I have made this mistake myself, planted along an existing native hedge. I planted a cherry laurel hedge, and it's very difficult to stop it, I suppose, spreading and clumping out the existing hedge that's there. And it does reroot, so you can get it spreading back through the hedge, So, branches touching the ground will reroot quite easily. And over time, if you didn't get to cut that for a year or whatever, that could end up like the Griselinia on the opposite side, if it's not going to be managed. So I would say leave out that one. Another good one is Portuguese laurels. So it's a darker leaf, smaller shaped leaf, not as, doesn't take over the way a cherry laurel can. And it's very easy to cut. So once a year, again, with a kind of a soft cut. So you're not cutting, kind of woody material. You're cutting soft growth. So that's a good option. And again, because I think you're near the coast, Oleria could be a good option there. Then I suppose another way of looking at it is the trees are going to remain there from what I believe. So the birch trees, so these are going to have to go at the front. So a tuya hedge. So a tuya hedge is basically a conifer hedge. And, there's some really good ones there. Tuya, smaragard, emerald. They're really good hedges. They're very, very solid. You can buy them quite big. They're very, very solid. They get to, meter and a half relatively quickly, as in 3-4 years, 5 years maybe, which, when someone's looking for privacy may not feel long, but in terms of growing a hedge, that is quite quick. So that's a good option. Or if you weren't going for an all-out hedge, you could just buy some kind of big tuya emeralds, for example. So maybe a line of tuya emeralds along there. They would give you that privacy that you're looking for. They don't have to be, exactly tight. You could leave a little bit of space for them, but you're kind of breaking that view. You're kind of making that less open, less visible into your kitchen and sunroom. And that's a good option, is adding in some really tall tuyas, like the likes of a tuya emerald, for example. So that's kind of options. To go back to your question on the phyllostachys or the bamboo, it's certainly that one does spread. So potentially, a phyllostachys could spread out to kind of 4 meters, 5 meters in width. And, so that's the kind of spread that you're looking for. And then what ends up happening is at the end of that, then you can get new plants forming and then they can spread out further again. So you end up, unless you're going to manage that really, really well, as in dig out, every couple of years, those really outliers, then potentially you are looking at something that's going to spread quite vigorously along that bank, and you don't really want that. So the other thing with a phyllostachys is that they can actually go to 5-6 meters, and they give you this thick sort of barrier of stems down low and then the leaves up on top. But of course, that's, all the leaves are up high, so they're not necessarily giving you that they're blocking it down further, but it's blocking it with stems, if you know what I mean. So they look really well, but you like the likes of bamboos and that kind of look. I'd be more inclined to get one that doesn't spread and get it into that flower bed, which we'll talk about in a second, that flower bed below the windows, and those beautiful windows that look out to the sea. So they're the options. If you were asking me to pick one for you, which I know you're not, you're kind of asking for options, I certainly would be going the route of Griselinia. Because there's one already there, you'll be able to get that one back into check, make it more manageable for yourself, and then you're duplicating it on the opposite side and it looks uniform. It will take a little bit of time for that, but Griselinia is relatively quick grown. So in terms of the privacy, it'll give you that bit of privacy relatively quickly. Still looking at 3-4 years, I guess. But that's kind of the quickest you're going to get unless you're going to buy really big plants initially. So that's a good option and would be my choice. And then obviously get the one on the opposite side back into check. The other thing that you mentioned you were struggling with was a gorse taking over a bank at the back of the house. So at the back of the house, there's quite a big slope. There was, or there sort of is on the plans, the potential to have a retaining wall there, but it's not going to happen initially. Budget at the moment is going toward the driveway, and at some point maybe the retaining wall, which I think she said was heading for kind of 20,000 euro to build this retaining wall. So most people at the end of a self-build don't have that kind of change to spare to do this kind of development work outside. Before I move off that, there is some possibilities because I think at some point there will be some form of retaining system needed at the back there because the bank of clay running up from the back of the house is quite high. And there might be something needed there in terms of just retaining and holding back that if you ever get any slippage or anything like that. So there's other options. It doesn't have to be, a mass concrete wall. So even, gabion cages are used quite a lot. Some people like them, some people don't. I personally don't like them, but they're brilliant ways at retaining areas, and they're, from a cost-effective perspective, they're way, way, way more cost-effective than building a solid concrete wall. And that could be an option. So don't, just because you've got a quote of 20 odd K, it doesn't mean that it's the only way of doing it. There is other options there. So yeah, have a look at that. And it's as I say, gabion walls could be a good option. Even things like railway sleepers doesn't have to be very high, but it could give you that little bit of a barrier if there is any slippage. To answer the question on the gorse, it's being cut every year at the moment and it's still coming back. Is there any ground cover that I can plant to basically drown it out? And the answer to that is no. The reason being, gorse is a funny plant. It's on its own, it's actually quite a nice looking plant, but its job is basically to survive. So you'll see it on the side of hills coming away from hedges, dense hedges. It always creeps outwards. And the reason for that is that it doesn't like any competition from higher growing plants that block out light. So that's the key to your success in terms of getting rid of it. If you want to block that out, and actually, if you look on the bank right up to the back of it, there's more trees, which they're either birch or alder. It's kind of hard to see in the picture. But what's happening is that they're creeping away from the trees because they don't like being shaded out. So that's what their function is. That's what their function is on the edge of a forest, for example, or on the edge of a hedge. They grow outwards. They actually fix nitrogen as well. But the main job is that seeds fall in there of other trees. The gorse protects them initially from being eaten by, particularly things like deer and that. Then that tree grows into an established tree eventually because it gets the chance to, because the gorse protects it initially. And then when the tree grows up, the gorse steps out from underneath it and moves on. And that's the way gorse is. So ground cover plants won't work there because they're just not going to block out the light. You're going to have to get something above it that's going to block out the canopy. And what you're looking for here is, taller trees, like what's at the back of that already. Now, whether that causes an issue in terms of slippage on that hill, I don't know. It could lock it in, make it even more stable, but I don't know. I don't know the makeup of the ground there. Is there a layer of soil on top of stone, for example? I don't know that. If there is, then potentially trees would do okay, but maybe not fully established and certainly not give you the ground stabilization that you might get elsewhere on it. So I don't know that. But to answer your question in terms of the ground cover plants won't get rid of gorse. They won't be tall enough to block out the light. And then the gorse more than likely would, I suppose, smother them out. If they establish it all, they're going to be sort of within the gorse. They're not going to be established on their own. So options are get trees in, or you're going to have to find some way of getting them removed completely, as in digging them out and keeping digging them out for a year or two until you're sure everything's gone, and then just don't let them reestablish. So that's kind of your options. But a good option is to get something tall that would stop them from, would basically smother them out, and they wouldn't survive there. But that will take a little bit of time. It's like all those things, it'll take a little bit of time. But that could be a good option. Then last point was the really nice flower bed that's created around the sunroom looking out onto the sea. There's endless possibilities there because that bed is quite a bit lower. It's a very, very steep slope on the site. So the fact that that bed is lower means that you can plant pretty much anything you want there. And even if something grows to 2 meters, it's still not going to block the view because there's such a drop there. You know, now you probably don't want something that high, but you can easily get plants that are going to go to a meter, meter and a half, all around the end of the sunroom, and you'll be looking out over those as you look out to that view of the water body, which I think is the sea, as I said. And yeah, endless possibilities there, from perennials to, if you're looking for more formal stuff like buxus cones or balls, any of those type things, a perennial border, as I say, mixing in some winter headers, winter flowering headers in there. Anything there is going to do well. It's going to look well, and yeah, it's a great bed to do something with, because of it's just really nicely situated. It curves completely around the sunroom, all the way. Starts on the footpath out from the sunroom, curves all the way around it, and finishes on the opposite side. And yeah, really, really nice bed, and lots of potential with that. So I hope that answers the question. As to this, the specific, if you're asking for my one, it's Griselinia, just because you have one there already. If I was starting from scratch, and if I was going to plant some hedge there, I would probably plant a Taxus baccata, maybe. The fact that there's already the fact that there's already some birch trees there, a more natural look of something like a holly could be good either. So there's lots of options. Another final option that kind of springs to mind, I guess, is again a more natural one. It's not evergreen, is beech. And I think that could be a good hedge as well, because even though it will definitely establish, it's going to be comfortable enough establishing there on that ground. You can buy it bare root, you can buy it quite big, and the fact that it holds its leaves, it's not evergreen, so the leaves will go brown in the wintertime, but the fact that it holds its leaves gives it pretty much the evergreen effect, because it holds its leaves right up until kind of there's 1 month or 6 weeks where the new buds are bursting, the old leaf falls off, and then there's 1 month or 6 weeks, as I say, where it looks kind of looks very bare, looks shabby for that point. But that's the only time of the year, that little small window of time, that's the only time of the year that I actually don't like beech. For the rest of the year, I think it's a fantastic hedge, and that could be a good option there, albeit not a fully evergreen one as such. Well, it's not an evergreen, but it gives you that evergreen effect. So, Siobhan, I hope that answers your question. I hope that gives you some insight. There's always, ways to do it that don't have to be the standard way. But certainly, with the fact that there's a hedge there already, a Griselinia one, I would be looking to double down on that and take advantage of that, and recreate it on the opposite side. So I hope that helps. I hope that gives you some clarity. If it didn't, just don't be afraid to send me a direct message. No issue covering those. And yeah, that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.